Hi, Corey.
Hi,
Thanks for joining me today to talk about EMDR.
I'm excited to talk with you guys.
Awesome. Well, let's jump in. And if you want to just start and give like a brief introduction, it'd be awesome.
So, I'm Corey Davis, and I got my master's in marriage and family therapy from Oklahoma Baptist University, which is kind of near Oklahoma City. And then I got my PhD from East Carolina University in North Carolina. And now I work at a residency program, which is where physicians go after med school to learn like the practical parts of how to be a doctor. So they got all the book knowledge and now they're kind of learning how to talk to patients and do that whole thing. And so I'm their behavioral medicine faculty. And so I work a lot with doctors and do some therapy too in their clinics. And yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Cool. Okay, so let's jump in to EMDR. Can you first start by just telling us like what initially like attracted you to the model or like maybe you want to learn a little bit more about it?
Yeah. Well, I really like trauma treatment. Um, and why I like it so much is because I feel like we can make a lot of progress really quickly when we process trauma, and it can be a big game changer for patients. So I've always been attracted to trauma treatment. And in my master's, I worked a lot with narrative exposure therapy, which is just another trauma model. And so I had learned that, and I wanted to kind of get more experience in different ways of treating trauma and what could work for different people, because narrative exposure therapy, just like it sounds, is a very like verbal processing talk
Mm,
therapy, and that doesn't fit for everybody, and it's sometimes really hard to talk about a lot of those things, especially when they go pretty deep, as a lot of our wounds and traumatic experiences do. So when I got the opportunity through my PhD program to get the training at a reduced cost, I jumped on it because I
awesome.
wanted to be able to broaden that skill set. And so far, it's been really helpful for me as a clinician and for my patients. So,
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Would you say, how would you have described like the training? Was it pretty intense?
yes, it is very intense. And I think that's something that I wasn't aware of before I came into it. And so, how it's structured is it's 2 full weekends. So, like 2 full days and a half day twice. So, you go to EMDR 1 and EMDR 2. And then in between there, you start practicing with your patients, because it's all, people who are therapists who take this training or physicians. So we start practicing, and then we see a consultant, which is kind of like a supervisor, but they're just specialized in EMDR. We see them 10 times. So for 10 hours of consultation. So we do that first weekend, 5 hours, the second weekend, 5 more hours. And then you want to get as much experience as you can in that time so that you can ask questions. And it's kind of like a group soup, and that makes it cheaper to go to group soup. But why it's such a difficult training for a lot of people, myself included, is because EMDR isn't as easy to practice on people without going deep. And so, what EMDR does and how it works is it bypasses our like inhibitions. And so, when we talk to a patient, they can formulate a response that doesn't go very deep. But when we are processing something internally through rapid eye movement, that passes our defenses and goes straight to what's deep. And so, if you, like many people, myself included, have trauma in your history, you can start
Mm,
by processing something really minor, like maybe a minor car accident or something very little that isn't connected, and your brain will move you straight to that big trauma experience or group of experiences. And so,
mm,
that being said, there's not a really good way to learn EMDR without practicing it, but it's
yeah.
also can be really triggering for a lot of people. So, my suggestion is bump up your personal therapy before you go, and then talk to your trainer, because there are ways that you can do EMDR and get that practice, and your partner can practice on you with going a little less deep. Which you don't know until you ask, because it's one of those things that you think, oh, I'm going to be fine, but most
Yeah.
of a lot of people were not fine, and we had a
Yeah.
big dropout rate after from the first to second one, because it was a bit of a traumatic experience for people because they just weren't ready to go there, and they weren't ready to go there in a professional capacity, which is completely understandable. But do know that it does go pretty deep. And that's just the nature of the model, which is why it's so effective with our patients. But in training, that can be one of those things that you just need to go in knowing that that's part of the equation.
Okay, gotcha. So in the EMDR training, are you saying that like you'll like part of the training is that it is done to you? And so,
Mhm.
oh, okay. That's interesting. That's very unique compared to like any other kind of theory or model of therapy that
Yeah.
we do. We typically don't have that theory practiced on us unless we're doing like role plays and we're making up a story. So that's a really unique concept.
And yeah, and it's questionable way to do it, but I think they want you to see how it works.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and it definitely do see how it works, but it's just something to think about before you hop into it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know that we talked about this offline for a minute, but I had shared with you about that this is for a postmodern theory class, and so I know EMDR is a little bit different than maybe our what we traditionally think of as a postmodern theory in terms of like narrative or solution focused. But I was wondering if you could speak to that piece a little bit.
Yeah, so EMDR is definitely postmodern. And I think it really falls well into these theories, into the group of postmodern theories because of kind of how it's set up. Different. And so I a lot of therapists do just only EMDR, but that's because all of their patients know that they're a trauma therapist and come to them for that. And so what I would suggest and how I practice is I have a theory that I stick to, which is narrative. And then when I find that my patient could really benefit from EMDR, I move over and still continue my narrative work. I use EMDR with them. And so I always recommend having a base theory and then adding this on as kind of a skill or something that you can use in conjunction with that, um, because it is a little bit different as far as how it works. And I don't go in the first session and just start doing rapid eye movement on people. I have to get a good history and we have to develop rapport and do all of those things that we do with all of our patients. And so while it is postmodern and it definitely falls into our theories, it's one of those that I think it would be beneficial to have a theory that you fall back on for how you do assessments and how you gauge
Yeah.
treatment goals, all those things, while using this as a tool. So.
Okay, that makes sense. And I feel like that would make it would feel better as a patient that way, that you're not just like walking into a room doing this like really intense trauma treatment and then leaving. And
Yeah.
there like not being a relationship or like any kind of anything else to kind of help facilitate that change.
Yeah.
Okay. And you had mentioned before that because of that, you feel like it's really helpful. Like in when you did the training at ECU, there were some master students also in that training, and it sounded like that was pretty difficult for them to be like learning like the fundamentals of being a family therapist and also trying to add EMDR training on top of that. So your recommendation was like kind of get those fundamentals down and then post masters maybe pursue something like the EMDR training. Is that okay?
Definitely. I think that would be best. And you guys know it's difficult to remember all the things we're supposed to remember anyways in our master's
Yes.
program, do all of the things. And so adding a manualized treatment like this, where there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of steps, isn't something that maybe you need right now, but it's definitely
Yeah.
something consider when you become a candidate and you're comfortable in your model and you want to expand and offer a different service.
I love that. I love that you're saying that because that's been a theme of the semester is that we are kind of exposing students to a taste of all of the MFT theories, and so they can kind of try out what fits well with kind of the view and the lens that they kind of view the world, and that they're not going to be masters in any of those one theories by the time they graduate, but that this is kind of to expose them and to get practice, and then they'll continue after graduation, kind of learning that theory even better. So I'm glad that you also highlighted the pressure and how much is kind of on their mind as they're trying to learn all of these theories and put them into practice with patients. So that's I think they would agree with that.
Mhm.
Um, So I guess I just want to kind of open it up. I know that I kind of sent you some questions about kind of case examples or times that you feel like it's worked really well. If there's anything else in general you want to share about EMDR, or if you just want to jump into a case example, that would be awesome too. Whatever you feel like would be helpful to share.
Yeah. So EMDR is a manualized treatment, and that's not something we see a lot in our postmodern theories. But what happens is you get a big workbook and there's a formula. And so you get a good history, just like we do with anybody. And then we do some scaling. And so what happens is we pick a constraining belief and a facilitating belief. So that constraining belief could be that I'm worthless, or I'm going to be stuck like this. Or in my case example, which is about nightmares, is I'm going to be stuck. Sorry, my cat really likes Zoom
I
calls.
love it. I love it.
That I'm going to have these nightmares forever, or I'm stuck like this, or whatever it is. And then we have a facilitating belief, or a belief that we want to believe. And so that's something like, I'm more than this trauma, or I have value, or something like that. And we scale those. And so we scale how true both of those statements are. And then go back to that as we do the eye movement. And that's how we gauge how much progress we're making as we reduce that constraining belief and move up that facilitating belief. And so once we get those scaled and those kind of put in, we can start with our eye movement. And so I'm sure you've seen the videos right now, but we usually do 2 fingers and go back and forth. And on average, I do it about 25 times. So back and forth 25 times. And I have them either make a picture in their mind, think about that belief, whatever it is that fits for them. It's usually a picture of that event. So in the case of a nightmare, he takes himself back to that nightmare. He holds it with the belief that I'm stuck like this, and I start doing the EMDR, and that's the eye movement, which is like this. And so for people, most of the time we do the eye movement, but we can tap on their hands too. So we tap like this.
Okay.
And that I don't do good with eye movement stuff because it kind of gives me a headache and I can't like focus enough. And so they do tapping on my hands if I was the patient.
Okay.
And so we do that about 25 times. And I ask, I say, what did you notice? And so I don't lead them in any direction saying, what did you hear? What do you think? And I just ask what they notice, and they tell me where they're at. And so they might say, I'm back in this dream. I can't get out. They might say anything like that. And I say, go with that. So I don't say, think about that or do that or process this more. I say, go with that, which is just a really neutral way of saying, stay here. Let's do process. And I do it 25 more times. And some people go 17, some people go 30, but I can watch their eyes and see that they're processing. And I let them go for a while, but if I see that they're really distressed, I back off a little bit. And they have a stop signal that they know that they can stop at any time. A lot of people get nauseous, not because of the eye movement, but especially with sexual assault, we get a lot of pain, and so we have that because it feels like we're really there. And what it's like is we're either watching a movie, and so we're really there, but we're safe because we're pushed back a little bit. But sometimes it feels like you're really in that movie, or if you're on a train watching the scenery go by. And that's what that is happening when we do the eye movement, is that traumatic experience, it's processing in our brain. And what is happening is we stop ourselves from processing fully through our trauma, and it stays there and it grows stronger and stronger. So what happens? So maybe we had a bad event at a bus stop, and so we start avoiding bus stops. And then we saw a bus in our neighborhood, so we don't go over there anymore. And it spreads like weeds, all these triggers we have, because we're not processing that trauma. And what EMDR does is it moves us straight to that root and brings us back there so we can process that fully. But that is a very intense experience for a lot of people. So one of my favorite patients, and he would be so pleased that I'm using him as a case example, medically induced trauma for a long time. He was on ECMO, which is when a machine is pumping your blood for you, because he aspirated, which means his something went down the wrong pipe and went into his lungs instead of down into his body. So he was on the ECMO machine in a coma-like state for a long time, and he was having a lot of nightmares after that because he had a lot of dreams and he didn't know what was real or not. And he would, when the pain medicine was less, he was more coherent, and then it would go in and out. And he was like that for a month. And so that's why he came to see me. And we had got a relationship. We filled out all of our constraining and facilitating beliefs. And then we started doing EMDR. And it took about 2 sessions of EMDR. And so that would be, I do 25. I asked him what he noticed. And by that time, he was able to process that trauma completely. And I do biofeedback too, which is measuring our physiology. And so a good indicator about the stress in our body is our temperature of our skin. So we usually put it on one of your fingers, and it has a sensor that measures how hot your temperature is. So our internal temperature, like when we have a fever, stays pretty consistent, but our temperature of our hands and different body parts, they get cold and hot based on our stress level. So I had him hooked up to that while I was doing the EMDR, because I just wanted to know, because I'm kind of a nerd about that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to see what would happen as we were processing this trauma. So I knew we were getting to the point where he was going to have a breakthrough. Like, we were chipping away on that traumatic experience. And while he was thinking, that facilitating belief was about to go. So it was waning. I mean, the constraining belief was about to go. So the I'm going to be stuck like this belief was about to be processed through, and he was believing it less and less. And that facilitating belief was coming up. And when I checked in and asked where he was with those things. And so I knew it was coming. So I had him hooked up to that, and we processed through really, he's really taught me that he let trauma go, and I could see him have that breakthrough, both with my eyes, because I could watch it on his face, because a lot of people are pretty expressive when they do EMDR, and through his body and his physiology. And so that's kind of how this works. And he'll tell you, like, he's like, this is some magic stuff. And I would too. But it's really funny how our brain works like that, and how this eye movement can tap into the memories and the things that we keep in our brain, but we keep kind of stored and stuck in a box, and we don't try to touch it very much. And that's why it has a lot of utility. And we hear about EMDR being really good for veterans, is because a lot of that trauma we don't want to talk about, and they don't want to talk about. And that makes a lot of sense. And so if we can bypass that and do it quickly, we get a bit better buy-in. For a lot of people, that's a really big selling point. And it's a really big selling point for me as a clinician, because we hear some horrible things in trauma therapy. People have gone through a lot, and I don't have to hear about all of those things, and they can still get help and process through. And that can be a really big clinician saver when you have a really large trauma population, because normally if I had a 20, 25 patient caseload, I would only have about 5 that have trauma that I'm actively working on, because it's just a lot on me as a clinician. But with EMDR, I can do a lot more, because I have some distance while still being able to do my job well. And a lot of my colleagues who do this as their primary job, remember, I teach residents, and so teaching is a big role in my job. EMDR has really helped their self of the therapist stuff, because they don't have to take it home as much as maybe if they were just talking about kind of the horrors of what happened to people in great detail. So
it's so interesting. That was awesome. It's so interesting, and it's so different than our traditional trauma treatments that are so kind of lengthy and in depth, and just kind of this idea of desensitization to like everything surrounding the trauma. And I wonder, I know that like for some kind of gold standard trauma treatments, there's a lot of psychoeducation at the beginning about like, this is what to expect. Is that also part of the EMDR process, or is there, okay, so that is
definitely. Okay. And so they have our contact info, and they're supposed to call if things are going. I teach them how to do it on themselves. So you can make a little butterfly, and you can do tapping on yourself like this. And so they do it at natural disasters with like children. We can do group like that. And so I teach them how to tap through some of the emotions they feel at home. They need to drink lots of water. They
Oh,
need to take it easy. They need to make
yeah,
sure that they don't have something big going on right after a session.
yeah,
A lot of the trauma processing happens after they leave my room, and it takes like 2-ish days before they feel the bulk of that. And
wow,
so give a lot of education about what that looks like and what to expect and how to get a hold of us. And I have a little more available between sessions for these
gotcha,
patients. What can come up.
yeah,
But once they see things moving, patients really buy into this model because they've usually tried a lot of different things,
yeah,
and like, oh, I went there and I wasn't as triggered, or I saw a picture of him and it wasn't as bad as it used to be, and they can start seeing that. And with
yeah,
EMDR specifically, we don't stop until we've gotten all of it. And so like we make sure it's at a 0. So we have no belief that that's stuck. And that picture doesn't, that we have in our mind of that event is completely desensitized. And then we moved on to another picture and desensitize that. Because it's so quick, we can desensitize almost everything about that event. And if they have multiple events, we start chipping away at some of those past events that we're not focusing on, and those go even.
okay,
So they had
gotcha,
3 events. That first one would take the longest, and then the second one, and then the third one would be subsequently quicker, because a lot of times there's commonalities and things stuck in there that come together. And so it's very interesting. And I get if you're like, what is this woo-woo stuff? And I totally understand that. And I thought that too. After watching it with my patients and experiencing it for myself, I could just see how helpful it was. And so I think they got a believer out of me, but a lot of EMDR people are pretty dogmatic about it. Like they're very like, come over to our side, whatever it is, but it is helpful. And so there are some of us that are normal and see its limitations too. And patients get a lot of benefit from it.
That's awesome. I want to jump into limitations, but before that, I'm glad you're mentioning that because I do think that when I first started hearing about EMDR kind of coming, being more popular, there did seem to be this pushback in like at least in the MFT community about it. And it was interesting that why, and I like the idea. And I think that there's a part of it that is, it's not accessible to every therapist. And so there's this component that we have to consider, and that might even be part of the limitation conversation, is that it's not accessible to every therapist. And what does that mean? Does that make it good or bad, or neither? And then, this idea that it's just so different and we don't totally understand the mechanics behind it. And if we don't understand the mechanics behind it, should we utilize it? And so it sounds like I'm sure by now there's probably long-term data talking about the effectiveness or harm or risks as well. Um, one of the things I was thinking about um, is this: do you find that it's helpful with not only kind of single trauma events, or even ones that are kind of more specific, like your patient who was in a coma, um, and also more kind of systemic, or even like I'm thinking like racial trauma, that feels maybe less like black and white than maybe like a single event trauma? I don't know. What's been your experience either learning about that or your own personal experience?
Yeah, I think it works similarly. Those single event
Okay.
traumas, especially if you get to them fast. So a lot of people, like right after natural disasters or right
Yeah.
after car accidents, if you get them very quickly, we can stop it from becoming kind of a triggering event. And so that is one useful like utility of EMDR that is very helpful for a
Yeah.
lot of people. So having that after big events
Yeah.
is great. For the long-term trauma, it still functions similarly. And so if they can make a picture in their mind of a piece of that trauma, and if they have a constraining and facilitating belief, we can do EMDR.
Wow.
And so
Okay.
I've even done that on portions of depression, or portions like, I don't feel like I'm a good enough mom, or I feel sad that this happened. And we can kind of
Awesome.
process that kind of stuff too. And so it
Yeah.
has some utility around like anxiety and depression. But it isn't going to help you build your coping skills, but it
Okay.
could change some of those beliefs that have like the core beliefs that we have that kind of root some of those things. And so with those longer, more systemic, more lifelong traumas, they might take a little bit longer, and we might have to change that picture and that belief a couple of times
Mm,
to
okay.
make sure we process the whole thing, but it still has its utility there.
Gotcha. I'm glad you brought up coping skills because I had that thought a few minutes ago and it left me. And so is there a role that kind of teaching coping skills like grounding or mindfulness or things like that play in EMDR? Or is that kind of where your kind of background and other kind of theories kind of plays a role in the work that you do?
I mean, you could certainly use coping skills that they already have or things that you like, but there are. So when you do eye movement fast, it helps process. When you do eye
Yes.
movement really slow, it helps. It's more like a comforting thing. So that's how we install beliefs that we want
Okay.
to keep, is by doing it very slow. And how we process once we don't want to keep is going more quickly. And so before we start, we install some good beliefs in it. And I know they're not like a machine. We're not like installing software on them, but we start using that slow eye movement to learn some coping skills. And so one of them is our safe, calm place. And so I do that with all of our patients. And so I had a very religious patient who imagined herself in the arms of Jesus, and she could see it and she could feel it, and she was really there. And so we did some of that slow
Mm.
eye movement. And so when we said arms of Jesus, she could go right back to that place and use it as a coping skill. And for another patient, it was the beach. And so he felt what it was like on the beach. He felt the wind, he heard the waves, and he was there. And we heightened that experience by using that EMDR installation process. And with kids, I have them draw a picture. And they look at that picture, and then we do some tapping, because I just do tapping with kids. They can't focus with their eyes. So they draw a picture of a place that's safe. And then they draw a picture of that traumatic experience, and they hate it and they don't want to do it. And then we process, and then we play games for 40 minutes and we do it one more time. But we can install those good coping strategies. We can use EMDR in conjunction with a lot of mindfulness strategies. So seeing a light going into
Yeah.
the body, which is something that we utilize in meditation and mindfulness anyways. So it's definitely built in. They give you a couple, but it doesn't mean you can't use some that you use anyways, but there is a function of installing good things too.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. It sounds like in listening to you, although it's a manualized treatment, it sounds like, and what I've read, is that like when you're doing EMDR, you might have like your preference, and I like how you even said, you don't necessarily you prefer tapping, to maybe the eye or to maybe the following the fingers, and so it sounds like there's a little bit of flexibility, and the therapist kind of adapts a little bit to kind of what they like or find to be helpful in their patient population, maybe?
Yeah. And I test it with each patient before. And so I say, this is how we're sitting, how are we doing? And we do a couple of rounds, and we're like, okay, how did that feel, without processing
Yeah.
anything. And then if they say I'm having a tough time with it, we move to tapping and see if that works. And when you do it sometimes there's a little light bar that you have a ball going back and forth on your screen. And so
Okay.
I don't do a lot of tele EMDR because I don't enjoy doing that. But
Yeah.
they do that sometimes, and sometimes there's these big light bars that are pretty large, and they watch the ball go back and forth, the big beat of light. And so there's a lot of different things that work for a lot of people. And people who do EMDR a lot, they get light bars because their arm gets sore, because they have to do it so much. And so like after a big day of EMDR, you kind of like feel it in your arm, and you get like tennis elbow or whatever it is. And so
Yeah.
that's why custom light bars are little vibrating hand things, so that they don't have to do the tapping, because it's
Yeah, that
therapy's
would
not
be
really
a toll on your, yeah.
but it's funny that that's actually a problem, but it is a problem for people.
Yeah. Yeah, you're taking a pretty sedentary life profession and adding quite a bit of movement that's consistent, right? So,
Hmm.
um, okay, that's really interesting. That also, I think, highlights that postmodern piece. Like even the way that you're asking questions and eliciting patient feedback,
Yeah.
all feels very postmodern to me. And being kind of flexible and adapting that treatment to what's going to be best for that individual client rather than from like a top-down approach, also kind of feels very postmodern. So I can certainly see that.
Not knowing. Like we know the model, but we don't know them. And so, and they have what they need to process through that. Yes, we facilitate eye movement and we facilitate the check-ins, but it's really them doing all the work. And that's really why it fits so well into postmodernism, is because they have what they need and we're just facilitators. So
I love that. I love that. And that's kind of been the hallmark of learning about postmodern and this idea of the not knowing stance and what does that look like in each of these models. And so for you to say like you're an expert in EMDR and how it functions and how it works and the benefits. But you're not an expert in what's going to work for that individual client. And so you have to kind of take that not knowing stance to learn that and then to facilitate in a way that's best for them.
yeah, and sometimes we have never even know really what it was that helped them process through,
Yeah.
and their brain did that for them. We have to be okay with that, because in
Yeah.
our talk therapy, we do get to know the trigger and we got to the root and we get that satisfying moment. But with EMDR, sometimes we check back in and they're like, yeah, that doesn't bother me anymore. And I'm like, yesterday that was really bothering you. Like that was a really big trigger yesterday. And they're like, nope, it doesn't. I'm like, what happened here? But we have to, because the patient is doing their own work and letting them be in charge. And so sometimes I'm like, I like second guess it because I think it can't be true, but it is, and they do
That's
their own
so
work.
that's so interesting. And it's so cool because you're right. As like doing talk therapy, that like insight and the connection that they're making and when they like break those triggers for the first time is so exciting. And so I can imagine that they come back and you're like, wait, what happened? This is where we were, and now we're
Yeah.
somewhere totally different, but this is where they want to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're like, I think I'm done. And I'm like, what? But they're not being hasty. They just really process through that, and they felt that relief and they're like, thank you, bye.
Yeah.
But
It's so
yeah.
interesting. I also love earlier bringing back a few minutes and you talking about the physiological piece and doing the temperature. Is that something that you learned in your training, or is that kind of additional training that you did to kind of add that the biofeedback into your practice?
Yeah, that's additional training.
Okay.
And a couple of other courses. It'd probably take you about the same time it would to be certified in EMDR, to be certified in biofeedback. And that was just a part of my PhD program. That was what I used my
Yeah.
left to get that certification. And I still need to take my exam. It's just expensive, so I haven't done it yet. But I
Yeah.
have all of the pieces for that. But it has some utility, and there are some things like you can look into heart math, and that
Hmm.
have some really easy to use things that are really easy to understand, that you don't need a certification or anything for, but it's bringing the body back into therapy and
Hmm.
physiology into therapy, which is a big part of how people experience trauma and stress and anxiety. But it isn't part of EMDR, but it can be. And when it is, it's really cool. So
Yeah, that's really cool. I also love the idea of biofeedback. We did heart rate variability for my master's thesis with military couples, and so I love the idea of bringing the body back in. Of course, from a biopsychosocial lens, right? Of bringing the body back into the work that we're doing and healing with patients is so important. So hopefully, our students, if they're interested in that, can maybe learn a little bit about how to incorporate biofeedback into therapy down the road after they graduate and aren't feeling overwhelmed. Um, I think that was a good segue into any limitations that you have seen or would consider for EMDR treatment or therapy.
yeah, it's pretty intense. And so if they have any current trauma, like things that are actively happening that are traumatic, or they're in an unsafe place, or even if they're just really stressed at work, or I don't know, in a master's program for therapy, it probably wouldn't be the best time to
Hmm.
do EMDR, because it is very intense and it's fast, and we have to have time for that. And so I hesitate starting it with people who have a lot going on, because it can bring a lot of things back up. And with trauma in general, it can be really important that we don't start to process the trauma while they're currently in it, and we facilitate that safety first,
Mm.
and not just safety as in like our safety plan, but like safety in, are they safe where they live? Are they safe at their job? Do they have coping strategies? And so that's one limitation, that it doesn't mean they won't do EMDR ever, but it just means that we need to do some work making the environment in their life a little bit safer.
Makes sense.
And some people don't like it because it's so intense. Some people want the insight. And so I said, great, we can do a different option. I usually give 2 options, and really explain what EMDR is as best as we can, because I know it sounds a little funky and patients hear that too. And then they'll choose kind of how we want to move forward, and we bring them apart. And so sometimes they just don't want to, and that's okay. And with kiddos, I make it more of a game. But I have a pretty frank conversation with their parents before we start, and say they might act a little funny. This might last a couple of days. They might start saying stuff and you're like, where is this coming from? And so if they have a rough go of it at work, or if something else is, or at school or something for the kids, I'll take a break from EMDR while all that stuff is going on, because it just is intense, and it's not like we have to keep it away from certain groups of people, but we just want to make sure we're safe while we do it. And then knowing if people have like eye problems, to move to tapping and stuff like that is a limitation, but one that we can get through pretty easy.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. This was an extremely helpful and interesting conversation about EMDR, and you kind of bringing to life like what we read in text, and kind of what we read about, in articles about what it looks like and how it can be beneficial. And I think you add some humanity to it, and I think that's really, really helpful, and kind of thinking about manualized treatments, especially because that's not a familiar model for family therapists. So it's helpful to kind of hear how a family therapist would use this type of lens. Um, and so any final thoughts that you'd like to share about EMDR, or kind of tips before we say goodbye?
Um, Yeah, I don't think it's something to be scared of. I know I like put up some things that are like kind of scary, but if you do your research and have good support, you're gonna be just fine. I think it really advances your work, uh, and gives you another skill in your toolbox that you can use with patients, and I think that's fantastic. And don't be scared about the manualized part. It feels manualized at first, but once you kind of get the flow, it just seems like any other model. And so
Yeah.
because I'm not a manual person. I'm like, please just let me do whatever I want to do. But it becomes second nature. And so that's good. But I do recommend it if that's something you're looking in the future. And a lot of my colleagues really like it too. And so something to consider. I'm a big fan. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending your morning with us talking about EMDR. It's going to be really helpful for my students, I'm sure.
Yep. Well, they can reach out if they have any questions, and I'm happy to answer them. So
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Corey.
thanks.